Chapter 13 of In the Pecos Country by Edward Ellis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13 The Encampment. Immediately after the harangue of Lone Wolf, a general dismounting of the warriors followed, and the mustangs, which showed admirable training, were left to themselves. The halt had been made where there was grass and water, to which the animals now paid their attention, while their owners prepared for their morning meal. There was a certain system in all this apparent confusion, and it being known that a halt would be made at this point, a half-dozen of the most skillful hunters of the party had scattered among the mountains in quest of game. By the time several fires were fairly under way, these providers began dropping in, all of them laden with the spoils of the chase, which were dressed and boiling over the different camp fires in an incredibly short time. The Apaches had reduced this thing to a science, and a company of trained soldiers could not have done the thing more expeditiously than did they. While it was all going on, Fred Munson walked to the brook near at hand, and taking a deep draught from the icy water, he stood somewhat apart from the others, watching the proceedings with a strange interest. At first, he failed to understand one thing. He knew from what he had seen that at least a dozen of the Apaches had been killed, and as many wounded on the night before during the fight, yet not one of these was visible, with the exception, perhaps, of Lone Wolf, whose scratches from Sut Simpson's bullets were of a superficial nature. The only explanation of the absence of these parties was that they had gone home. Under the charge of a strong escort, they had taken another route, and were probably miles away at that moment, and most likely in their own wigwams, receiving the nursing and attention required.
"I wonder if there's any chance of my getting away," mused the lad, as he looked searchingly about him. "If a fellow could only get the start, there are plenty of places where he might hide. But there's where the trouble is."
On the right and left of the gorge were precipitous mountains, evidently broken by chasms, ravines, and covered with patches of wood, their elevation being so moderate that no snow was visible upon their tops, while the scene was wild and forbidding in the extreme.
"If I were only up there," sighed Fred, as he looked at the mountainside, "I could crawl into some of the places where I'm sure they couldn't find any signs of me."
This might all be, provided the lad had an hour or two in which to hunt his hiding place, but the whole difficulty lay in getting that opportunity. It was not to be supposed that the Apaches were so stupid as to give a young captive like him a chance to slip from their hands in broad daylight. They were too shrewd for that, and Fred felt that he must wait for some better opportunity than the present. The meat was prepared in short order, and then the Apaches fell to like so many wild beasts, using only their fingers and teeth. A large quantity of food was provided, and the redskins were rapidly disposing of it. When the lad saw that no one was likely to offer him any, he struck in and helped himself. This morning halt of the war party lasted about an hour, during which Fred felt that there was little attention being paid him. Considerable earnest talk was indulged in by the warriors, who were apparently discussing some important plans with Lone Wolf, the whole thing resolving itself into a sort of council of war. When they leaped upon the backs of their mustangs, the decision had been made, and preparations made for carrying it out without delay. The whole party started up the gorge, Fred riding again with the Apache Paulo, while Lone Wolf kept himself at the head of the force.
"I thought he would be mad enough to kill me," mused the boy, as he caught sight of the notorious chief, "for the reason that I gave him such a scare night before last. It can't be that he has forgotten it, or that he doesn't know who I am. But maybe he is going to do something dreadful to me after he gets me home."
What the real purpose of Lone Wolf was could only be conjectured, but there was reason to believe that he meant to hold his prisoner for a ransom, as the aboriginal scamp was very partial to that kind of business. By carrying the lad back among the mountains, he could hold him against the army of the United States, utterly refusing to yield him up until he should receive his price. The mustangs galloped along at an easy gait for a mile or so, when the canyon or gorge divided in a manner precisely like that which is frequently observed in the highways or streets of a city. Lone Wolf instantly turned the head of his mustang to the left, and, without checking him in the least, continued at a sweeping gallop in that direction, followed by all of his warriors, save 3. These were Wauko and 2 companions, scarcely less repulsive in appearance, who wheeled their steeds to the right. Without any exchange of word or signal, they sped down the ravine, and in less than a minute the 2 parties were lost to sight of each other. What this meant was a mystery as baffling as the other, but Fred concluded that Lone Wolf had gone in quest of some other party of his warriors, and had sent Wauko and his 2 companions as an escort to conduct him to some place where he would be beyond all danger of rescue. The shrewd Apache chief, in doing this, only acted with ordinary discretion. He knew Sut Simpson through and through, and had not a particle of doubt that the hunter was already on their track, and that he would use every exertion to recover the lad. Hence, the most important thing to do was to get forward without any loss of time. He had a full night's start of the scout, who could only press his pursuit by daylight when the trail was visible, and there was no reason why the 3 men who had the lad in charge should allow the fleetest-footed mustang to catch up with them. Fred, as it may be supposed, was gratified to find his companions so suddenly and greatly reduced in number, for it seemed to him at once that his chances of escape were increased tenfold. It simplified matters. It did not occur to him that 3 vigilant Indians were as effective as 300, and that in a certain sense his prospect of deliverance was diminished rather than increased. He was a boy, and as hopeful as his years. The day remained sunshiny and pleasant, and the easy canter of the mustangs caused just enough breeze to make the riding delightful. Fred felt an unconquerable aversion to the Apache Wauko, whose horrible face and appearance caused him more than once to half suspect that he was a ghoul or a demon. He again made an attempt to open communication with him, but he uttered a sort of grunt that Fred took as a command for silence, and he resolved that he would die before he would repeat the attempt. The gorge continued its winding course among the mountains, some of the turns being at very sharp angles. The width of the ravine varied from 50 to 500 feet, the walls on either side showing about the same difference of altitude. At times they were perpendicular, and then again sloped at such a moderate angle that a horse could have galloped up them without difficulty. The mountainous nature of the country rather increased than diminished, and looking right and left in the front and rear, the jagged peaks were forever visible, the distances varying, but the number greater and greater. At times it seemed as if the ravine were about to terminate suddenly against the solid wall of the mountain, but as they rode forward, the open way was there, albeit the angle was sharp, and the little party suffered no interruption of progress until near the close of the day. The noon halt, which Fred expected, was not made. He was hungry, and supposed that the Apaches were, but if so, they manifestly considered it of more importance to get forward than to satisfy that hunger. Once or twice they permitted their horses to drink from the water when it was reached, but these momentary halts were all that were made. It was near the middle of the afternoon when Wauko, who was the leader of the little group, suddenly showed great excitement, which speedily communicated itself to his companions. All 3 of these scamps were sullen and reticent, frequently riding for hours at a time without exchanging a word, so that this excitement meant something. The 3 halted simultaneously, talking loudly and excitedly, so that Fred suspected that some cause for a quarrel had abruptly sprung upon them.
I wonder if they're wrangling about me, was the thought that came to the lad, who immediately recalled the fate of Miss McCrea during the Revolution, when the 2 Indians conducting her to Fort Edward settled a quarrel over her by sinking a tomahawk in her brain. If the present excitement could be quelled only by such a remedy, he preferred that it should go on.
Otherwise, if there was a prospect of their settling it by falling upon each other, he was in hope of seeing it intensified. It looked as if a deadly fight were impending when he was tossed to the ground, and the three Apaches instantly dropped to the earth and faced each other. End of Chapter 13. Read by Thomas Rose. Chapter 14 of In the Pecos Country by Edward Ellis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 14 The Strange Camp. The Apaches, however, were not quarreling. They were engaged in a dispute, or rather argument, which concerned them all, and about which it was all important that no blunder should be made. Fred Munson, the instant he found himself upon the ground, moved timidly back so as to be out of the way when the expected clash of arms would come, and he watched the three men with an intensity of interest which can scarcely be imagined. He now noticed for the first time that as the disputants talked, they all three pointed and looked at intervals up the mountain, showing that the all-absorbing topic was located there. Following the direction indicated, the boy noticed the smoke of a campfire rising from the side of the mountain about a quarter of a mile in advance. It could be seen plainly and distinctly, although the fire itself, from which the smoke came, was imperceptible. It was evident, therefore, that the discovery of this campfire had produced the excitement among the Apaches. And why should such be the case? The fact of it was that the three Apaches were upon territory which could by no means be considered the exclusive tramping ground of their tribe. Immediately to the eastward roamed the Kiowas and Comanches, and it was no more than natural that their warriors should come into occasional collision, especially when none of them were disposed to recognize any of the presumed rights of the other. The dispute, therefore, was regarding the campfire which had suddenly appeared to plague them. Did it belong to their friends or enemies? Lone Wolf, in sending his three warriors homeward with the captive, dispatched them by a roundabout method through the mountains, for the reason that it would be more difficult to trail them. The advantage which they had gained in the start, he was confident, placed it out of the power of Sut Simpson or any of his friends to do them injury. But here, while carrying out the directions of their chief, they found themselves confronted by an unexpected danger. If the Kiowas, or Comanches, as the case may be, discerned the little company, they would not fail to observe that they had a prize in their possession, and they very probably would show a disposition to interfere. The wrangle was as to whether it was best to go directly ahead upon the route they were pursuing, trusting not only to the possibility that the strangers there were friends, but to the prospect of their getting by without detection, or whether they should go to the trouble of a flank movement. Wauco was inclined to go directly ahead, while the others were opposed, and as is frequently the case with such people, the dispute was excited and hot for a while. But the hideous Apache triumphed by virtue of his official position. Lone Wolf had placed the lad in his charge, and he was bent upon managing the business in his own fashion. It was agreed, therefore, that they should continue on up the ravine, as this offered so much the better chance for their mustangs to make good progress. Wauco took the lead, his horse walking at a steady gait, while he scrutinized the campfire as closely and searchingly as if his life depended on the result. The flame seemed to have been started directly behind a mass of rocks, large and compact enough to shelter a dozen men if they wished to conceal themselves. The smoke showed that it was burning so vigorously that fuel must have been placed upon it but a short time before. It would seem that if set going by hostile hands, the owners were short-sighted in thus exposing their location. But the mischief of such a thing is that the smoke of a campfire in an Indian country may have one or more of a dozen dangerous meanings. In the West and Southwest, the Indians have a system of telegraphy conducted entirely by means of signal fires from mountain top to mountain top. Treaties signed in Washington in one day have been known hundreds of miles away at night by the redskins chiefly concerned, who had no means of gaining the news except by some system of telegraphy understood only by themselves. The most cunning and effective war movements, where the success depends upon the cooperation of widely separated parties, have been managed and conducted by the smoke curling upward from hills and mountain peaks. Still further, a campfire is frequently used as a way of confusing an approaching enemy, for by what means could the latter judge whether the parties who had kindled it were in the immediate neighborhood? Was there not in this instance one stealthy Kiowa carefully keeping up the blaze, while his companions had stolen around and across the chasm, where they were ambushed and awaiting the coming of their victims? Were not the sly dogs successful in hiding their positions by the very means which would generally be supposed to betray it? At any rate, Waukko was not yet abreast of the dangerous point when he again checked his mustang, and the three Apaches consulted in a low voice, with every appearance of suppressed excitement. There was something in the wind which made all three feel anything but comfortable. The consultation was brief and decisive. Waukko and one of his warriors dismounted, leaving Fred and his guardian upon the remaining horse. Waukko moved off to the right, as though he meant to reconnoiter the campfire, while the other savage stole off to the left. Very evidently there was something which needed looking after, and it may have been that Waukko was in quest of information for his leader, Lone Wolf. Be that as it may, before Fred Munson fairly suspected it, he found himself alone with another mounted Apache, both the others having vanished as effectually as if the ground had opened and swallowed them up.
"Now's my chance, if I can only get an opening," was the truthful conclusion of the lad, whose heart suddenly beat with an awakened hope. "If I can manage to get this old fellow off, or if I could steal a little march on him so as to gain a chance, I could escape. Anyhow, I'm going to try it," he added, and his boyish heart was fired with a renewed determination to make a desperate leap for liberty. One Apache, however, if he attended to his business, could guard him as effectually as a dozen, and it all depended upon the disposition this warrior should manifest. Just now his great and all-absorbing interest was in the efforts of his comrades to detect the meaning of the signal fire. Fred sat behind him upon the horse, and he stealthily looked to the right and left in the hope of detecting some place which offered an opportunity for concealment, for he felt that there would be but the single chance offered him. If he should fail in that, the savages would guard him too closely to permit a second effort. The ravine at this place was about 100 feet in width. The sides sloped abruptly downward, growing nearly perpendicular further ahead, so that the Apaches, if caught in any trap at all, would be caught in the worst possible manner. Hence the extreme caution they displayed before committing themselves. There were rocks and stones on the right and left, and here and there some stunted vegetation. A few minutes' start would give anyone a chance to hide, but just there was the whole difficulty. How was the start to be obtained? It seemed at this juncture as if the fates were unusually propitious. Everything conspired to invite the attempt which the boy was so anxious to make. Waukko and his companion had not been gone more than 10 minutes when one of them signaled to the Indian left behind. It came in the shape of a soft, low whistle, which could easily be mistaken for the call of a bird. The horseman started and turned his head sideways to listen the instant it fell upon his ear, and this caused Fred to notice it. The Indian held his head a moment in the attitude of deep attention, and then he replied in precisely the same manner, without turning his head. A full minute passed. Then a second call was heard, emitted in precisely the same manner as before. This was the one which did the business. The trained ear of the veteran scout could have detected no difference that had been made, but there was, for all that, and a very wide one so far as meaning was concerned. The redskin had no sooner caught it than he dismounted
and moved carefully forward, his mustang quietly following him, bearing the lad upon his back. The warrior glanced backward only once to satisfy himself that his steed was there and understood what was required of it. In the meantime, the heart of Fred was throbbing painfully with hope. He felt as if Providence was interfering directly in his behalf.
"Now is my time," he added a moment later.
End of Chapter 14. Read by Thomas Rose. Chapter 15 of In the Pecos Country by Edward Ellis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15. A Leap for Liberty. It seemed that nothing could be more favorable for the attempt to escape. There was Fred, seated upon the back of a mustang. His copper-colored captors were some distance away at the side of the ravine, while the only Indian in sight was a dozen feet ahead with his back toward him. True, there was the risk of being shot, but he felt that he did not deserve safety unless he was willing to run that or any risk. There was a loose rein hanging on the neck of the mustang. Fred gently pulled it, and the beast stopped. He was walking so quietly that his hoofs made scarcely any sound in falling upon the flinty surface, and the Indian, from some cause or other, failed to notice the cessation of sound until the distance between them had about doubled. At that instant, the redskin turned his head as quick as lightning. Fred, who had been wishing for that identical movement, whirled the steed about and started him back in the ravine at full gallop, the brute responding gallantly to the sudden demand made upon him. The fugitive was expecting a shot from the rifle in the hand of the Apache, and he threw himself forward upon the horse, so as to make the target as difficult to hit as possible. But the Indian did not fire, not only on account of the risk to his favorite mustang, but because it would have been certain to disarrange the reconnaissance upon which Waukko and his companions were engaged. But the redskin did not stand in stupid helplessness. A glance told him everything, and running with extraordinary swiftness to the nearest mustang, he vaulted upon his back and started in pursuit, putting his animal upon the jump from the first. The few seconds' unavoidable delay gave the young fugitive something like 100 yards start, an advantage which he used every effort to increase, and which, for a brief spell, he succeeded in doing. Fred's object was to avoid a regular chase, for he dreaded that, in such case, the superior knowledge of the country possessed by the Indian would enable him to outwit him at every turn. Night was close at hand, and if he could dodge the redskin until darkness, the lad was confident of escaping him altogether. For a short distance the ravine continued in almost a straight line, and then it turned at a sharp angle. Without attempting to guide the mustang in the least, Fred kept himself thrown forward with his arms about his neck, while he hammered his sides with his heels, spoke sharply to him, and did everything he could to urge him to the highest possible rate of speed. The animal whirled about the corner, and with his neck extended, went down the ravine with almost incredible swiftness, a speed which was steadily drawing him away from his pursuer, and which would have carried him beyond his reach in a brief time, but for a singular and altogether unexpected check. The pursuing redskin saw his charge quietly slipping from his grasp, and he must have viewed the wonderful speed of his favorite mustang under the circumstances with mixed emotions. At any rate, it took him but a short time to see that in a stern chase he had no chance of coming up with his own animal, and so he commanded him to halt. This was done by a peculiar, tremulous whooping sound, which he had used scores of times to summon his animal to him, and which had never failed. Nor did it fail now. Fred was careering along at this amazing speed, congratulating himself meanwhile upon his cleverness, when the brute checked himself so suddenly that the rider narrowly escaped being pitched over his head. He jerked the bit and pounded his heels against his ribs, but it was of no avail. The horse had pricked up his ears, neighed, and was looking back with very much the appearance of an animal that was in a mental muddle. The Indian saw it and repeated the signal. Thereupon the mustang wheeled and started backward at a gallop directly toward his master.
"If that's your idea, I'm not going with you,"
gasped the lad, who slipped off his back as nimbly as a monkey and made a dash for the side of the ravine without any clear idea of where he was going. It seemed that there was no possible escape for the lad, for the Indian was but a short distance behind him and was twice as fleet of foot as he. But one of those fortunate interferences, which seemed to be in their nature like special providences, occurred at this juncture. The flight and pursuit of Fred Munson took place at a critical period in the affairs of all parties, and so mixed up the business that it was thrown entirely out of gear and almost into inextricable confusion. It seemed that there was a party of Kiowas in hiding, and awaiting the chance to open fire upon the approaching Apaches. The sly scamps saw every movement of the warriors, and it looked as if the flies were about walking into their trap when the unexpected byplay occurred. There must have been all of half a dozen Kiowas, enough to extinguish the Apaches, and when Fred Munson started his flight, 2 of the Indians hurried down the ravine for the purpose of taking a hand in the business. They unavoidably fell behind in such a trial of speed, but when they saw the Apache about to reach out his hand to grasp the fugitive, 2 shots were fired almost simultaneously at him. They were intended to kill, too, for the Kiowas, who were actuated by no love for the despairing white boy, felt that they could afford to give him this temporary respite. They were certain of their own ability to step in and pluck the prize at the very moment it might seem to be beyond their reach. Rather curiously, however, neither of the shots did what was intended. One of them missed the Apache altogether, and the other only slightly wounded him. As it was, however, the pursuing warrior was dumbfounded, and he stopped as suddenly as if smitten by a bolt from heaven. Leaving his mustang to look out for himself, he darted to the opposite side of the ravine from that taken by the lad, for the purpose of securing cover before a second volley could be fired. Fred heard the report of the rifle shots, and supposed that he was the target, and that they had been fired by Waukko and his companion. Instead of stopping to ascertain, he continued his flight with all the desperation of combined hope and despair. A few seconds sufficed to carry him across the ravine and among the rocks, boulders, and stunted growth. The panting fugitive was rendered almost frantic by the thought that he was about to elude the redskin after all. As he bounded into cover, he cast a terrified glance backward to see how close to his heels was his dreaded enemy. Not an Indian was visible. But although Fred failed to see anything of his enemies, he could not but believe that they were somewhere in the immediate neighborhood, and he did not relax his efforts in the slightest. Such strenuous efforts speedily exhausted him, and after climbing, clambering, and stumbling forward and upward for some 20 rods or so, he tripped and pitched forward upon his face, where he lay panting and so weak that he could not rise. He was sure he heard the footsteps of his pursuer but a short distance away, and the most that he could do was to raise his head and glance furtively in the direction. He had not the strength absolutely to rise to his feet and run away. Again and again he was confident that the Apache was close to him, but still he did not become visible, and all this time Fred was rapidly regaining his strength. In a very short time his rapid breathing subsided, and he felt his old vigor and vitality creeping back into his limbs. He was ready to spring to his feet again, but he did not deem it best. It seemed to him that the warrior had lost sight of him and was looking about. If the boy therefore should rise to his feet, he would be the more likely to be seen, and if he remained where he was sure of being found. He compromised the matter by crawling forward on his hands and knees, listening and looking, and continually pausing to prevent creeping into the arms of his enemies. All this time night was approaching, and with the passage of each minute came a corresponding rise in the hopes of the fugitive. Fred kept moving forward upon his hands and knees, climbing higher and further away from the point of danger. Everything remained as silent as the tomb. The Apache that Fred fancied was so close upon him was in reality playing hide and seek with the Kiowas, a business which is generally conducted in silence, unless the stillness be broken by the occasional crack of the rifle or the death yell of one of the participants. The footsteps which the boy fancied he heard were all in his imagination. In fact, he was alone. No human eye saw him or took cognizance of his movements. For the present, he was left to himself. There was but one who held him in view and remembrance at this critical juncture. To him Fred appealed again and again to lead him through the labyrinth of peril and to permit him to return in safety to his friends. Still the boy picked his way along, as does the frightened animal, and still he failed to see or hear anything of his enemy. Meanwhile, the gloom deepened, and with the passage of every moment his heart lightened, until he felt, for the time being at least, his safety was assured. End of Chapter 15. Read by Thomas Rose. Chapter 16 of In the Pecos Country by Edward Ellis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16. The Reconnaissance. It was a mystery to young Munson why the shots fired, as he supposed, by the Apaches should have checked his pursuer, who was so close upon him. Had he known that they came from a couple of hostile Kiowas, and that they were intended for the warrior whose hand was outstretched to grasp him, the matter would not have been so hard to understand. But he saw the night closing in about him, while he remained among the rocks, moving forward in the same stealthy manner upon his hands and knees, and his strained ear failed to catch the slightest sound that could make him fear that any of his enemies were near at hand. Of course, he looked with all the eyes at his command, but they also stared upon a blank so far as animated creation was concerned. At last, Fred halted, tired out with this species of locomotion.
"I do believe I've given them the slip," he exclaimed, his heart throbbing more than ever with renewed hope. "I don't exactly understand how it was done, but I thank the Lord all the more for it."
He now arose to his feet and reconnoitered his own position. So far as he could judge, he was fully 200 yards away from and above the ravine where he had made this successful attempt at escape. The day was so far gone by this time that he could barely discern the open space which led through the mountain. His view on the left was shut off by the angle to which reference has been made, and on the right the gathering obscurity ended the field of vision. As soon as he was able to locate the gorge, his eyes roamed up and down in quest of those from whom he was fleeing. Not a glimpse could be obtained. It was as if he had penetrated for the first time a solitude never before trodden by the foot of man. Satisfied of this pleasant fact, he then made search for the smoke of the campfire, which was the real cause of his escape. No twinkling point of light revealed its location, but having decided where it was first seen, he fancied he could detect the faintest outline of a column of vapor rising until, clear of the crest of the mountain behind it, it could be seen outlined against the sky beyond. He more than suspected, however, that it was merely imagination. Leaning back against a boulder, the lad folded his arms and endeavored to take in the situation in its entirety.
"Thank the Lord that I have a good start," he mused, his heart stirred with deep gratitude at the remarkable manner in which he had eluded the Apaches. With the knowledge that, for the nonce, he was clear of his enemies, several other facts impressed themselves upon his mind, facts which were both important and unpleasant. In the first place, he had not eaten a mouthful of food since morning, and he was hungry. He had swallowed enough water to stave off the more uncomfortable sensation of thirst, but water is not worth much to appease the hunger. He felt the need of food very sorely. In the next place, he could think of no immediate means of getting anything to eat.
He had no gun or pistol, nothing more than his simple jackknife. The prospect of procuring anything substantial with that was not flattering enough to make him feel hopeful. And again, now that he had freed himself of captivity, how was he to make his way back to New Boston, where friends were awaiting him with little hope of his return? He had traversed many miles since the preceding night, and had gone through a country that was totally unknown to him. To attempt to retrace his footsteps without the aid of a horse was like attempting that which was impossible. While in the act of fleeing, he thought not of these. He was unconscious of hunger, and forgot that he was so many miles from home, but now both conditions were forced upon him with anything but a pleasant vividness. But all of Fred's ingenuity was unequal to the task of suggesting a way whereby his want could be supplied. Even had he a gun, there was not much show for anything like game in the darkness of night, and thus, under the most favorable circumstances, he would be forced to wait until morning.
"I'm pretty tired,"
he said as he thought over the matter,
"and maybe if I get a sleep I can keep it up until morning, and in that way worry through the night. But I tell you, Fred Munson, I would like to have a good square meal just now. There is fruit growing here and there among those mountains, but a chap can't find it at night. Now, if there was only some camp of the hunters where I could get in and—"
He abruptly paused as his own words suggested an idea. It was a campfire to which he owed his escape. Why couldn't he use it still further? Was it not likely that the Indians who had kindled it had taken their meals there, and that there might be some remnants of the feast which could be used to satisfy his hunger? It was not a very pleasant prospect to contemplate. It was like going back into the lion's mouth, nor indeed could it be considered a very wise proceeding to return to the very spot from which he had escaped by such a providential interference. But a hungry or thirsty man is not in the best mood to reason, and the incapacity is still more marked in an excessively hungry boy. The prospect of getting something to eat overshadowed all other questions, and after several attempts to consider the matter fairly, Fred came to the conclusion that he would make the attempt. To do this, it was necessary to go back over the same path he had followed, and to return to the very spot where he had been ready to break his neck if it would assist him in escaping but a short time before. But he reasoned that he had the darkness in his favor, that the Indians were not likely to stay in the same place, and that none of them would be looking for his return. This, together with the prospect of securing something to satisfy his hunger, easily decided the question. Within 5 minutes from the time the thought had entered his head, he was carefully picking his way down the mountainside toward the ravine. Fred did not forget the precaution necessary in a movement of this kind. He moved as silently as he could, pausing at intervals to look and listen, but the way remained clear, and nothing occurred to excite alarm until he had descended into the gorge itself. At this precise juncture, he was startled by the sharp crack of a rifle, which seemed to come from a point 200 or 300 yards away, directly behind him. In his terror, his first fear was that the shot had been aimed at him, and he started to retrace his steps, but before he went any distance, he reflected that that could not be, and he stood motionless for a few minutes, waiting to see what would follow. All remained as quiet as before, and after a time he resumed his cautious movement along the ravine, keeping close to the side and advancing on tiptoe like a thief in the night. The further he got along, the more convinced did he become that he was venturing upon a foolhardy undertaking, but when he hesitated, his hunger seemed to intensify and speedily impelled him forward again. At the end of a half hour or so, he reached a point in the gorge which he judged to be at the foot of where the campfire was, and he began the more difficult and dangerous task of approaching that. As upon the night before, there was a moon in the sky, but there were also clouds, and the intervening rocks and stunted vegetation made the light treacherous and uncertain. Shadows appeared here and there, which looked like phantoms flitting back and forth, and which caused many a start and stop upon the part of the young scout.
"I wonder where they have gone,"
he said to himself fully a score of times as he picked his way over the broken land.
"Those two Apaches must have come back by this time, and I hope they knocked the other one in the head for letting me get away. They must have been looking for me, but I don't think they will hunt in this place."
Fred had made his way but a short distance up the side of the mountain when he became assured that he was upon the right track. Standing upon a lower plain and looking upward, he saw that the column of smoke from the campfire was brought in relief against the sky beyond. The vapor was of nearly the same rarity as the natural atmosphere, and was almost stationary, a fact which also proved that the fire from which it arose had not been replenished, as in such a case a disturbance would have been produced that would have prevented this stationary feature. When the lad was within some 50 yards of the campfire, he discovered that he was not nearly as hungry as he supposed, and at the same time he began to suspect that he had entered upon a very risky undertaking.
"I don't know how I came to do it," he said to himself as he hesitated. "If there's a campfire in this part of the world, it must have been kindled by Indians, and it's very likely that some of them are hanging around, so that if I attempt to get too close, I'll tumble right into their hands. I can wait till tomorrow for something to eat, so I guess I'll go back."
But curiously enough, he had scarcely started to act upon this decision when he was tormented more than ever with hunger, and he turned about with a desperate resolve.
"I won't stop again. I will go."
As has been already intimated, the campfire which had played such an important part in the events of the afternoon had been started immediately behind a large rock, the evident purpose being to mislead the very ones who were deceived by it. Consequently, the boy could not gain a fair view of it without making a detour to the right or left, or by coming rather suddenly upon it from behind the rock. Just then it was shut out entirely from view. Fred stole along like a veritable Indian scout until he was within arm's length of the rock. Then he sank down upon his hands and knees, and making sure that he was enveloped in shadow, he crept forward with the utmost possible stealth, until at last he reached a point where he had but to thrust his head forward around the corner, and the campfire would be before him. Here it was natural that he should pause a while longer, for the very crisis of this perilous task had been reached. The silence remained as profound as the tomb. Not a rustle, not the slightest sound, even such as would have been made by a sleeping person. Surely no one could be there. The campfire must be deserted, and all his precaution useless. End of chapter 16. Read by Thomas Rose. Chapter 17 of In the Pecos Country by Edward Ellis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17. Foraging for Food. Fred's fear was that if any of the Apaches were near at hand, they would hear the beating of his heart, so intense was his excitement and anxiety. But delay seemed only to increase it, and pressing close to the corner, he removed his cap and stealthily shoved his head forward until he could look along the other side. At the first glance, he jerked back as if he had caught the flash of a rifle aimed at him, for the sight that he gazed upon was startling enough. Within 10 feet of him sat an Indian warrior, his knees gathered up, his back against the arch, and his head bowed as if in slumber. The lad's first supposition was that the redskin was waiting for him, and had seen his head as it was thrust forward and drawn back again. But as he listened, there was no sound to betray any movement, and when he recalled the terrifying picture that caught his eye, he remembered that the face of the warrior was not turned toward him, so that it was hardly to be supposed that he could have observed the stealthy movement. By carefully considering the matter and reassuring himself, Fred soon gained sufficient courage to repeat the attempt. This time, after pushing his head forward enough to see the redskin, he held it motionless sufficiently long to take in the entire picture. The first thing which impressed itself upon his mind was the fact that the Indian was not an Apache, or at least did not belong to the trio which had had him in charge. His dress and make-up were altogether different, and he clearly belonged to another tribe. The truth of it was, he was a Kiowa, and his attitude was that of a sleeping person. A dirty blanket was gathered about his shoulders, and his head, with its straggling horsehair covering, drooped so far forward that the line of the face was at right angles with that of the chest. The updrawn knees were separated enough to permit a long, gleaming rifle to rest between them, the barrel partly supported by the shoulder, with the stock at his feet, while if the aquiline nose, clear cut against the dim fire beyond, had descended 3 or 4 inches lower, it would have been shut off from view by the same knees. The blanket was thrown back far enough to reveal the body, legs, and moccasins of the warrior, which were those of a man of powerful frame and great activity. The campfire had smoldered as though it had not been replenished for hours. Still, it diffused a steady, subdued glow from the other side of the figure, as if the latter were stamped in ink, and the picture was a striking one in every respect. After Fred had scrutinized it a few minutes, he gathered more courage and took in the surroundings. These were not very extensive, but such as they were of a hopeful nature. Just in front of the sleeping Indian were several objects lying upon the leaves, which he was certain were the bones of some animal, most probably a deer or buffalo.
"And if they are, there's meat upon them," was the consideration of the lad, who smacked his lips in anticipation. That might be, but how were they to be obtained? That was the all-important question. It was not to be supposed that the most skillful scout in the West could creep up to the feet of a sleeping Kiowa and gather some food without an almost certainty of detection. But for the fact that Fred was so hungry, nothing could have induced him to make the attempt. As it was, he believed that he could succeed. At any rate, he resolved that the attempt should be made. "Maybe he'll wake up and turn over," reflected the boy, as he fixed his eyes upon the Kiowa and watched him like a cat waiting for a mouse to come within its reach. "I wonder whether Indians snore," added Fred a moment later. "I can't hear him breathe, and yet his chest seems to rise and sink just as regular as anybody's."
Some 10 minutes more waiting brought the boy to the second crisis in his perilous undertaking. With another ejaculated prayer, he crept out from the rock and moved toward the feast, as he believed it to be. He knew where the fragments lay, and heading in that direction, he moved carefully forward, while he kept his eyes fixed upon that dreaded redskin, who certainly seemed a remiss sentinel when in an enemy's country. Only a few feet interposed, and these were speedily passed over, and Fred stretched out his hand to lay it upon what seemed the greatest prize of his life. So indeed it proved. The Kiowas, at some time during the day, had cooked some antelope meat by that very campfire, and had scattered the remnants all around. The first thing which Fred grasped was a bone upon which still remained considerable half-cooked meat. His hunger was so consuming at that moment that, forgetful of the redskin sitting so near, he began gnawing the bone like a famished dog. Never did food taste sweeter and more delicious. If the boy's jaws had been a little stronger, he would have crunched up the bone also, but he cleaned it of its nutritious covering so speedily and cleanly that it seemed as if done by some wonderful machinery. When he found that no more remained, he clawed about in the semi-darkness for more, and found it. Indeed, it looked very much as if the Kiowas had left one of their rude meals prepared for some expected visitors. When fairly under way, Fred did not stop until he had fully sated his appetite, and there proved to be enough to satisfy all his purpose. Then, when he craved no more, he awoke to a keen realization of the extremely perilous position in which he was placed.
"I had better dig out of here,"
was the thought that came to him as he glanced furtively at the motionless figure.
"He doesn't see me yet, but there's no telling how soon he will."
And now the extraordinary good fortune which had attended the boy up to this time seemed to desert him. He had scarcely begun his return to the cover of the rock when he felt a sudden desire to sneeze coming over him. He grasped his nose in hope of checking it, but it only made matters worse, and the explosion which instantly followed was twice as great as it would have been otherwise. Poor Fred was in despair. He felt that it was all over, and he was powerless to move. He was like one overtaken by a dreadful nightmare when he finds himself unable to escape some appalling evil that is settling down upon him. He turned with a despairing glance to the redskin, expecting to see the glitter of his tomahawk or knife as it descended. The warrior did not stir. Could Indians sleep so sound? Surely not, and the boy just then recalled the fate of the sentinel Thompson a couple of nights before.
"I believe he is dead,"
he muttered, looking attentively toward him and feeling a speedy return of his courage. With a lingering fear and doubt besetting him, he crept around the corner of the rock, taking one of the bones as he did so, and when in position, he gave it such a toss that it dropped directly upon the head of the unconscious red man. This was not a very prudent way of learning whether a man was sleeping temporally or eternally, when so much depended upon the decision of the question, for if he were only taking a nap, he would be certain to resent the taking of any such liberties with his person. The test, however, was effectual. The bone struck his head and glanced as though it had fallen against the surface of a rock, and Fred could no longer doubt that the redskin had been slain while sitting in this very attitude by the fire. Such was the case. There had been plotting and counterplotting. While the Kiowas were playing their tricks upon the Apaches, the latter managed, to a certain extent, to turn the tables. When they branched out upon their reconnoitering expedition, Waukko was engaged in the same business. When he discovered the single sentinel sitting by the fire, he crept up like a phantom behind him and drove his hunting knife with such swift silence that his victim gave only a spasmodic quiver and start, and was dead. Waukko placed him in the position he was occupying at the time he first caught sight of him, and then left his companions to learn the truth for themselves, while he crept back to learn that his prisoner had given his captor the slip. Fred Munson was terrified when he found he was standing by the dead form of his friend Thompson a couple of nights before, and so in the present instance a certain awe came over him, as it naturally does when a person stands in the presence of death. But for all that, the boy was heartily glad, and he had wisdom enough to improve the splendid opportunity that thus came to him, and for which he had hardly dared to pray.
"I don't see what a dead man can want of a gun," he muttered, as he moved rather timidly toward the figure, "and therefore it will not be thieving for me to take it."
There was a little involuntary shuddering when he grasped the barrel and sought to draw the weapon from its resting place. The inanimate warrior seemed to clutch it, as though unwilling to let it go, and the feeling that he was struggling with a dead man was anything but comfortable. Fred persevered, however, and speedily had the satisfaction of feeling that the rifle was in his possession. The weapon was heavy for one of his size, but it was 1,000 times preferable to nothing. He stood hefting it, as the expression goes, and turning it over in his hand, when he heard the report of a second gun, this time so close that he started, thinking it had been aimed at him. Such was not the case, but at that moment there came an overpowering conviction that he was doing a most foolhardy thing in remaining so conspicuously in view, when the redskins were liable to return at any moment and wreak their vengeance upon him for the robbery, to say nothing of the death of their comrade, which might be attributed to him. So he hurriedly and quietly withdrew into the outer darkness. End of Chapter 17. Read by Thomas Rose. Chapter 18 of In the Pecos Country by Edward Ellis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 18. Alone in the Ravine. Fred Munson felt that he had been extremely fortunate, not only in securing a good, substantial supper, but in getting a rifle. With it, he could guard against danger and starvation. In that country, and especially among those mountains, was quite an abundance of game, and he had learned how to aim a gun too well to prevent his throwing any shots away. By this time the night was well advanced, and he concluded that the wisest thing he could do was to hunt up some place where he could sleep until morning. This did not seem to be difficult in a country so cut up and broken by rocks, and he moved away from the campfire with a deep sense of gratitude for the extraordinary good fortune that had followed him from the time Lone Wolf had withdrawn him from the main party.
"Now, if I could only get a horse," he said to himself, "I would be set up in business. I could find the way back to New Boston in a day or two, shooting what game I want and keeping out of the way of all Indians. I wonder what has become of Sut Simpson. I expected he would be somewhere around here before this. It would be very handy to come across him just now and have him help me home. And there's Mickey O'Rooney. He went off with one of the best horses, and if he could pick me up and take me along, it wouldn't need much time for us to get back home. Ah, if I only had Hurricane here," he sighed. "How we could go back through that ravine, leaving behind us the best horses in the country. But there's no use thinking of that. Hurricane is at home, and so he can't be here, and I must trust to Providence to get back. I have something now that is of more use than a horse. If I miss with one charge, I can—"
He stopped suddenly in amazement, for at that juncture he recalled a piece of great stupidity which he had committed. He had secured the rifle, and yet he had left without one thought of the indispensable ammunition that was required to make the weapon of any use. He did not know whether the gun in his hand was loaded or not, in which latter case it was of no more account than a piece of wood.
"Well, if that don't beat everything," he muttered,
at a loss to understand how he could have committed such an oversight.
"I never once thought of it till this minute, and now it's too late."
The reflection of his great need inclined him to return to the campfire and incur the risk involved in the effort to repair the blunder that he had committed.
"That Indian cannot hurt me, and I don't suppose that any of the others have come back. It won't take me long to get what I want, and I will do it, too."
He was but a short distance from the place, and having decided upon the proper course, he moved rapidly back upon the path he had just trod, and in a few minutes was beside the rock, which was becoming familiar in a certain sense. Mindful of the danger to which one was always exposed in that section, Fred peered around the rock with the same silence and caution as before. The result was a disappointment. The Kiowa had disappeared.
"Now, it can't be that he was only pretending he was asleep all the time," thought the puzzled lad. "And yet, if he wasn't, how was it he managed to get away?"
A few minutes' reflection convinced Fred that it was impossible that there should have been any such thing as he had imagined at first. The more reasonable theory was that some of the Kiowas had returned and taken the body of their comrade away, fearful, perhaps, that some of the Apaches might put in an appearance again and rob him of his scalp. However, whatever the explanation was, Fred saw that his expedition was a failure. There was nothing to be gained by remaining where he was, while there was unmistakable risk of being detected by some of the copper-colored prowlers. He noticed that the campfire bore very much the same appearance as when he last saw it, and the probabilities were that the Kiowas were some distance away at that very time, but the young fugitive had already run enough risk without incurring any more, and he resolved to spend an hour or two in getting out of the neighborhood altogether. There was little choice of direction, but it was natural that he should prefer the back trail, and clambering down into the ravine again, he turned his face to the southward, directly through the ravine that he had traversed during the day upon the back of Wauko's mustang.
"I can tell when I reach the place where Lone Wolf and his men left us," he said to himself. "That will take me a good while, but when I do find it, the trail will be so much larger and plainer that there will be no trouble about following it. But it will take me several days to do it, and it's going to be hard work. I need all the time possible, so I guess it will be best to keep going all night."
There was not so much amusement in this as he fancied, but he kept it up bravely for some 2 or 3 hours, during which he made good headway. The walking was comparatively easy in the ravine, which was one of those openings encountered at intervals among the mountains in the west, and which are known under the name of passes. In many places it would be utterly out of the question for parties to force their way through the chains, but for these avenues which nature has kindly furnished. The moonlight was just sufficient to make the boy feel uneasy. He could discern objects, although indistinctly, nearly 100 yards away, and where the character of the gorge was continually shifting to a certain extent, there was abundant play for the imagination. He had been walking but a short time when he abruptly halted, under the impression that he had seen an Indian run across the gorge directly in front of him. This caused a wilder throbbing of his heart and another examination of his gun, which was loaded, as he had assured himself some time before, and ready at any time to do him one good turn, if no more.
"He wouldn't have skipped over in that style if he had known I was so near,"
was the reflection of the boy, as he sheltered himself in the shadow of the rocks and looked and listened.
"How did he know but what I might have picked him off? What was to hinder me? If he didn't know I was here, why, it ain't likely that he would loaf along the side of the ravine."
By such a course of reasoning, he was not long in convincing himself that the way was open for his advance. He hurried by on tiptoe, and drew a long breath of relief when certain that he had passed the dangerous spot. But he was only a short distance beyond when his hair fairly rose on end, for he became certain that he heard the groan of a man among the boulders over his head.
"I wonder what the matter is there,"
he whispered, peering upward in the gloom and shadow.
"It may be some white man that the Indians have left for dead, and that still has some life in his body, or it may be an Indian himself who has met with an accident. Hello!"
Just then it sounded again, and a cold shiver of terror crept over him from head to foot as he was able to locate the precise point from which it came. The frightful groaning did not stop as suddenly as before, but rose and sank with a sound like the wail of some suffering human being. As Fred stood trembling and listening, his shuddering fear collapsed, for the sound which had transfixed him with such dread he now recognized as the whistling of the wind, which, slight in itself, was still manipulated in some peculiar fashion by a nook in the rocks overhead.
"That does sound odd enough to scare a person," he muttered as he resumed his walk. "It must be a regular trumpet blast when the wind is high, for there isn't much now."
The two incidents resulting so harmlessly, Fred was inspired with greater confidence, and advanced at a more rapid walk along the ravine, suffering no check until he had gone fully a mile further. Just then, while striding along with increasing courage, he came to a place where the side of the ravine was perpendicular for 200 or 300 feet. He was close to this, so as to use the protection of the shadow, and was dreaming of no danger, when a rattling of gravel and debris caused him to look up, and he saw an immense mass of rock that had become loosened in some way, descending straight for his head. End of Chapter 18. Read by Thomas Rose. Chapter 19 of In the Pecos Country by Edward Ellis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 19. The Mysterious Pursuer. Young Munson made a sudden bound outward, and just as he did so, a mass of rock weighing fully a dozen tons fell upon the precise spot where he had stood, missing him so narrowly that the blast of wind, or rather concussion of the air, was plainly felt. The boulder broke into several pieces, its momentum being so terrific that the ground for several feet around was jarred as if by an earthquake. The lad was overcome for a moment or two, for he realized how narrow his escape was from a terrible and instantaneous death.
"That was a little closer than I ever want to come again," he exclaimed. "It seems to me that a person is always likely to get killed, no matter where he is or what he's doing. I don't suppose that anybody threw that down at me," he continued in a half-doubting voice, as he stepped a few paces back and again peered into the gloom. If it had been during the daytime, he might have suspected that some scamp had managed to pry the mass loose and to send it crashing downward straight for his head. But as the case stood, such a thing could not have taken place. Fred continued his flight until nearly midnight, by which time his fatigue became so great that he began to hunt a place in which to spend the remainder of the night. He had not yet seen any wild animals, and was hopeful that he would suffer no disturbance from them. The single charge of his rifle was too precious to be thrown away upon any such game as that. The lad was in the very act of leaving the ravine when his step was arrested by a sound too distinct to be mistaken. It was not imagination this time, and he paused to identify it. The sound was faint and of the nature of a jarring or murmur. He suspected that it was caused by horses' hoofs, and he listened but a few minutes when he became certain that such was the fact. "There must be a big lot of them," he thought, as he listened to the sound, growing plainer and plainer every minute. "I wonder if Lone Wolf and his men have not done what they started to do and are going round home again."
Judging from the clamping hoofs, such might have been the case. At all events, there was every reason for believing that a party of horsemen were in the ravine, and that they were headed in his direction. Fred made up his mind to wait where he was until they passed by. He had no fear of being seen, when the opportunity for hiding was all that could be desired, and lying flat upon his face, he awaited the result. Nearer and nearer came the tramp, tramp, the noise of hoofs mingling in a dull thud that sounded oddly in the stillness of the night to the watching and listening lad.
"Here they come,"
he muttered, before he saw them. But the words were scarcely out of his mouth when a shadowy figure came into view, instantly followed by a score of others, all mingling and blending in one indistinguishable mass. The forms of animals and riders were plainly discernible, but they came in too promiscuous fashion to be counted, and they were gone almost as soon as they were seen. Fred was confident that 30 warriors galloped by him in the stillness of the night.
"I believe it was Lone Wolf and some of his men," he muttered, as he clambered down from his place among the rocks.
Having been thoroughly awakened by what he had seen, he determined to walk an hour or more longer, for he felt that the best time for him to journey was during the protecting darkness of night.
"There ain't anybody to make me get up early," he reasoned, "and when I go to sleep I can stick to it as long as I want to. It seems to me that if I walk all I can tonight, and keep at it the most of tomorrow, I ought to be somewhere near the place where we came in among these mountains. Then a day or two's tramping over the back trail will take me pretty nearly to New Boston. That is, if nobody gobbles me up. I've got a rough road before me, but God has guided me thus far, and I'll trust him clean through. I've had some wonderful escapes to tell about."
He was too wide awake and too much on the alert to forget precisely where he was, or to fail to take in whatever should occur of an alarming nature. That which now startled him and suddenly cut short his musings was the sound of a horse's hoofs close behind him. Fred had been duped by his own fears and imaginings so many times that he could not be served so again. and as he was not apprehending anything of the kind at that moment, there was no possibility of escape from the reality of the sound. He halted and turned his head like lightning, grasping his rifle in his nervous, determined way, as he peered back into the gloom, whispering to himself,
"That must be Lone Wolf, or some of the warriors coming back to look for me."
This was rather vague theorizing, however. Look and stare as much as he chose, he could detect nothing that resembled man or animal. He shrank to one side and waited several minutes, in the hope that the thing would explain itself, but it did not, and after waiting some time, he resumed his journey along the ravine, keeping close to the shadow on the right side, and using eyes and ears to guard against the insidious approach of any kind of foe. Sometimes, under such circumstances, when a sound has very nearly or quite died out in the stillness, there seems to come a peculiar eddy or turn of wind, so that which causes the sound passes for an instant at a point which is so situated as to impel the waves of air directly to the ear of the listener. Fred did not exactly understand how this thing could happen, but he had known of something of the kind, and he was gradually bringing himself to explain the thing in that fashion, when his theory was upset by such a sudden, violent rattling of hoofs so close behind him that he leaped to one side, fearful of being trampled upon.
"That's a pretty way to come upon a fellow,"
he gasped, whirling about with the purpose of shooting the redskin for his startling introduction. But neither rider nor horseman was visible. The watcher could scarcely believe the evidence of his own senses. It seemed to him that the Apache, as he believed him to be, must have turned abruptly aside into some opening in the side of the ravine, but he could not remember having seen any place that would admit of such strategy. When he came to reflect upon it, it seemed impossible.
"Well, that beats everything," he said with a perplexed sigh. "That sounded so close that I expected to be run over before I could get out of the way, and now he's gone."
He waited some minutes, and hearing and seeing nothing, once more resumed his stealthy way along the gorge, a new shivering fear gradually creeping over him, as it does over any one who suspects himself in the presence of the unexplainable and unnatural.
"I wonder whether they have ghosts in this part of the world," he said to himself. "I used to hear the men talk of such things, but Father said there was nothing in them, and so I didn't believe them. But I don't know what Father would say or think if he was in my place."
There was the strong counter-belief also, the conviction that most likely there was a reality about the thing, which kept Fred on the qui-vive. He was determined, if possible, to prevent a repetition of the startling surprise of a few minutes before. He scrutinized the side of the ravine as he walked along, on the lookout for any opening or crevice which would permit a man and a horse to find shelter. It did not seem possible that any retreat that would shelter them could escape the eyes of the lad.
"I haven't seen any such place yet, so if the Indian is trying any such trick, he can't do it here without my seeing him, and if I do, Heaven save me!"
He sprang to one side, again pressing himself back against the rock, as though trying to flatten his body there in order to escape the trampling hoofs. At the same time, he cocked his rifle with the purpose of giving the finishing touch to the Apache, who had alarmed him once too often in this fashion. End of Chapter 19. Read by Thomas Rose. Chapter 20 of In the Pecos Country by Edward Ellis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 20. An Uncomfortable Lodging. A more astounding surprise than before awaited the lad. His hair almost lifted itself as he found himself staring at vacancy, with no sign of a living person in sight. Whatever had been the cause of this mysterious performance, it was very apparent that the solution rested not with the young fugitive.
"I'm tired of this," he exclaimed impatiently after he had waited several minutes, "and it isn't going to be played on me again."
With this, He began clambering up out of the ravine, with the resolve to reach some place where no shadowy horseman could ride over him. The climbing was difficult at first, but he soon reached a point where the inclination was not so steep, and where he could progress with much more ease and facility. In this way he in time reached the upper level, and, believing himself out of range of his phantom pursuer, had time to look about for some sleeping place for the night. He frequently paused and listened, but could not see or hear anything of man or beast, and, confident that no danger was to be apprehended from either, he devoted himself to hunting for some refuge that he could consider secure against molestation. His first inclination was to seek out a place among the rocks, as he was likely to gain room where he could stretch out at his ease and enjoy a few hours' slumber, but on reflection there were several objections to this. In that part of the world were an abundance of poisonous serpents, and he had a natural dread of disturbing some of them.
If I can find the right kind of tree, I think that will be the best sort of place, for nothing could get at me there, and there may be all the limbs I want to make a bed. I guess there's the location now."
He was walking along all the time that he had been thinking and talking, and at this juncture he approached a straggling group of trees, which seemed likely to offer the very refuge he was seeking. He made his way toward them with quickened steps. Fred found himself upon a sort of plateau, broken here and there by rocks, boulders, and irregularities of surface, but in the main easy to be traversed, and he lost no time in making a survey of the grove which had caught his eye. There were some 20 in all, and several of them offered the very shelter. The limbs were no more than 6 or 8 feet above the ground, and the largest trees were 50 feet in height, the branches appearing dense and capable, apparently, of affording as firm a support as anyone could need while asleep.
"I guess that'll do,"
he concluded, after surveying the largest, which happened to stand on the outer edge of the grove.
"If I can get the bed, there ain't any danger of being bothered by snakes and wild animals."
Fred naturally pondered a moment as to the best means of climbing into the tree with his gun. It was full size, and of such weight that he had been considerably wearied in carrying it such a distance, but it contained a precious charge to be used in some emergency that was likely to arise, and no man was wealthy enough to buy it from him. The way that he decided upon was to leave the gun against the trunk of the tree, and then climb in the way that comes natural to a boy. The barrel, of course, would bother him a little, but he could pull through very well, and he immediately set about doing so. As he expected, the gun got in his way, but he managed it very well without knocking it down, and in a few minutes had climbed high enough to grasp the first limb with one hand, which was all that he desired, as he could easily draw himself up in that fashion. Fred had just made his grasp certain when he heard a peculiar yelp and a rush of something by him. Not knowing what it meant, but apprehending some new danger, he drew himself upon the limb with a spasmodic effort, and then turned to see what it meant. To his amazement and terror, he discovered that it was an immense wolf, which had made a snap at and narrowly missed his heels. It had come like a shadow, making no announcement of its presence, and a second or two sooner would have brought the two into collision. As Fred looked downward, the wolf looked upward, and the two glared at each other for a minute or so, as if they meant to stare each other out of countenance. The wolf was unusually large, belonging to what is known as the mountain species, and he seemed capable of leaping up among the limbs without any extra effort. But wolves are not addicted to climbing trees, and the one in question seemed to content himself with looking up and meditating upon the situation. It seemed to the lad he was saying, "Well, young man, you're up there out of my reach, but I can afford to wait. You'll have to come down pretty soon."
"If I only had some powder and ball," reflected Fred, "I'd soon wipe you out."
The temptation was very strong to spend the last bullet upon him, but he could not fail to see the absurdity of the thing. Besides which, His gun was seated upon the ground, with the muzzle pointed upward at him. He could reach it from his perch on the lowermost limb, but it was hardly safe to attempt it while his enemy was seated there upon his haunches, as if debating whether he should go up or not. The boy was in terror lest the brute should strike the piece and knock it down, in which case it was likely to be discharged, and to be placed altogether beyond his reach. But the dreaded creature sat as motionless as if he were a carved statue in front of some gentleman's residence, his eyes fixed upon his supper, which had escaped him by such a narrow chance. The situation was about as interesting as it could well be, and in fact it was rather too interesting for Fred, who was alarmed at the prospect of being besieged by a mountain wolf. After the lapse of a minute or two, the brute quietly rose from his haunches, trotted a few paces, and then gave utterance to the dismal wail peculiar to his species. It had a baying, howling tone which made the chills creep over the boy from head to foot. He had heard the barking and howling of wolves when crossing the prairies, but there was deep, thunderous bass to the one which now struck upon his ear, such as he had never before heard, and which gave it a significance that was like the voice from the tomb. The instant the brute left his station, Fred reached down, seized the muzzle of his gun, and drew it up. Then he made his way some 20 feet above, where he could feel secure against any daring leap from his foe. He had scarcely perched himself in this position when the bay of the wolf was answered from fully a dozen different directions. He had called to his comrades, and their replies came from every point of the compass, the same rumbling, hoarse, wailing howls that had notified them where a prize awaited them. A minute later the brute trotted back to his place, where he sat down until the arrival of reinforcements.
"It isn't one wolf, but 100 that's going to besiege me," gasped the terrified boy.
He spoke the truth. End of chapter 20. Read by Thomas Rose. Chapter 21 of In the Pecos Country by Edward Ellis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 21 A Terrible Night. The prospect of being besieged all night in a tree by a pack of mountain wolves was not a pleasant one by any means, and Fred, who had climbed up among the branches with the object of securing a few hours' slumber, found little chance of closing his eyes for even a minute.
It might have been worse, he reflected, as he listened to the dismal howling, for if they had happened to come down upon me when I was walking along the ravine, I couldn't have gotten into any place like this in time to save me. Wolves don't know how to climb trees, and so long as I stay here, I'm all right. But I can't stay here forever.
By and by there was a sharp pattering upon the ground, and then the hoarse howling changed to quick, dog-like yelps, such as these animals emit when leaping down upon their prey, and which may be supposed to mean exultation. Fred came down sufficiently far from his perch to get a glimpse of the ground beneath. He saw nearly a score of huge mountain wolves bounding hither and thither and over each other and back and forth, as though going through some preliminary exercise so as to prepare themselves for the feast that was soon to be theirs.
"If I was down there," thought the boy with a shudder, "I suppose I'd last them about 2 minutes, and then they'd be hungrier than ever. They'll stay there all night. But I wonder if they'll go away in the morning. If they don't, I can't tell what's to become of me."
He watched them a while with a lingering fear that some of them might manage to get among the branches, but they did not make the attempt. They had sufficient dexterity to leap from the ground up among the lowermost limbs, but had no power of retaining their position or doing anything after they got there. Nature had unfitted them for such work, and they did not try it. They seemed to possess tireless activity, and they kept up their leaping and frolicking as though they had nothing else in the world to do. After watching them until he was tired, Fred carefully climbed up among the branches again, where he secured himself as firmly as was possible. He had lain his rifle across a couple of limbs above his head, and fixed upon a place within a dozen feet or so of the top, as the one offering the best support. Here 2 or 3 limbs were gnarled and twisted in such a way that he could seat himself and arrange his body in such a way that he could have enjoyed a night's slumber with as much refreshment as if stretched out upon a blanket on the ground. But the serenade below was not calculated to soothe his nerves into soft, downy sleep, and he shuddered at the thought of sitting where he was for 4 or 5 hours, with the pattering feet below him, varied by a yelp or howl, when he should feel disposed to close his eyes.
But then it can't be helped,
he added to himself, endeavoring to look philosophically at the matter.
I ought to be thankful that they didn't catch me before I reached the tree, and so I am, and I would be very thankful, too, if they would go away and leave me alone. I've got a bed here twice as good as I expected to find, and could sleep as well as anywhere else.
Almost any sound, long continued, becomes monotonous, and thus it was that scarcely a half-hour had passed when, in spite of the dreadful beasts below, his eyes began to grow heavy and his head to droop. But at this juncture he received a terrible shock. Just as everything was becoming dreamy and unreal, he was startled by a jarring of the tree, as though struck with some heavy object. When it was repeated several times, his senses returned to him, and he raised his head and listened.
"I wonder what that can be," he said to himself. "Is someone hitting the tree? No, it isn't that."
It seemed not so much a jarring of the trunk as a swaying of the whole tree. Puzzled and alarmed, Fred drew his legs from their rather cramped position, and picked his way downward among the limbs until he had descended far enough to inform himself.
"Heaven save me, they're in the tree!"
he gasped, paralyzed for the moment with terror. In one sense, such was the case. The frolicsome wolves had varied their amusement by springing upward among the lowermost branches. A brute would make a jump, and, landing upon the limb, sustain himself until 1 or 2 of his comrades imitated his performance, when they would all come tumbling to the ground. Thus, it may be said, they were climbing the tree, but they were scarcely in it when they were out of it again, and Fred had nothing to fear from that source. In his fright, he hastily clambered back again after his rifle, with the intention of shooting the one that was nearest, but by the time he laid his hand upon the weapon, his terror had lessened so much that he concluded to wait until assured that it was necessary, and a few minutes' waiting convinced him that he had nothing to fear from that source. It was only another phase of the hilarious fun they were keeping up for their own amusement.
"I guess I'll try it again,"
concluded Fred, as he proceeded to stow his arms and legs into position for the nap which he came so near commencing a few minutes before. He did not consider it within the range of possibility that he should unconsciously displace his limbs during sleep sufficiently to permit him to fall. He heard the yelping and occasional baying below, the rustling among the limbs, and the undulation caused by the animals leaping upward among the branches, but they ceased to disturb him after a time, and became like the sound of falling water in the ears of the hunter by his campfire. It was not long before slumber stole away his senses, and he slept. A healthful boy generally sleeps well, and is untroubled by dreams, unless he has been indulging in some indiscretion in the way of diet. But the stirring scenes of the last few days were so impressed upon the mind of Fred that they reappeared in his visions of night, and he lived them all over again. He was again standing in the silent wood along the Rio Pecos with Mickey O'Rooney, watching for the stealthy approach of the Apaches. As time passed, he saw the excited figure of Sut Simpson, the scout, as he came thundering over the prairie with his warning cry of the approach of the redskins. The rattling fight in front of the young settlement, the repulse of the Apaches, the swoop of Lone Wolf and the lad's capture, the night ride, the encampment among the mountains, his own singular escape, and finally his siege by the mountain wolves. All these passed through the mind of the sleeping lad, and finally settled down to a hand-to-hand fight with the leader of the brutes. Fred fancied that the two had met in the ravine, and, clubbing his gun, he whacked the beast over his head every time he leaped at him. He struck him royal, resounding blows, too, but somehow or other they failed to produce any effect. The wolf kept coming and coming again, until at last the boy concluded he would wind up the bout by jumping upon and throwing him down, and then deliberately choking him to death. He made the jump, and, awakening instantly, found that he had leaped out of bed and was falling downward through the limbs. It all flashed upon the lad with the suddenness of lightning. He remembered the ravenous wolves, and with a shuddering horror which cannot be pictured or imagined, felt that he was dropping directly into their fangs. It was the instinct of nature which caused him to throw out his feet and hands in the hope of checking his fall. By a hair's breadth he succeeded, but it was nearly the lowermost limb which he grasped with his desperate clutch, and hung with his arms dangling within reach of the wolves below. The famished brutes seemed to be expecting this choice tidbit to drop into their maws, and their yelps and howls became wilder than ever, and they nearly broke each other's necks in their furious frolicking back and forth. The moment young Munson succeeded in checking himself, he made a quick effort to draw up his feet and regain his place beyond the reach of the brutes. It was done in a twinkling, but not soon enough to escape one of the creatures, which made a leap and fastened upon his foot. The lad was just twisting himself over the limb when he felt one of his shoes seized in the jaws of a wolf. The sudden addition to his weight drew him down again, and almost jerked his hold from the limb, in which event he would have been snapped up and disposed of before he could have made a struggle in the way of resistance. But he held on, and with an unnatural spasm of strength, drew himself and the clogging weight part way up, kicking both feet with a fury of despair. The wolf held fast to one shoe, while the heel of the other was jammed into his eyes. This, however, would not have dislodged him, had not his own comrades interfered and defeated the brute by their own eager greediness. Seeing that the first one had fastened to the prize, a half-dozen of them began leaping upward with the purpose of securing a share in the same. In this way they got into each other's way, and all came tumbling to the ground in a heap. Before they could repeat the performance, the terrified lad was a dozen feet beyond their reach, and climbing still higher. When Fred reached his former perch, he was in doubt whether he should halt or go still higher. His heart was throbbing violently, and he was white and panting from the frightful shock he had received.
"That was awful,"
he gasped, as he reflected upon what had taken place.
"I don't know what saved me from death. Yes, I do. It was God," he added, looking up through the leaves to the clear moonlit sky above him. "He has brought me through a good many dangers, and he will not forsake me."
After such an experience, it was impossible that sleep should return to the eyes of the lad. He resumed his old perch, but only because it was the most comfortable. Had he believed that there was a possibility of slumber, he would have fought it off, but there was not.
"I'll wait here till morning," he said to himself. "It must be close at hand, and then maybe they will go away."
He looked longingly for some sign of the breaking of day, but the moonlight, for a long time, was unrelieved by the rose flush of the morning. End of Chapter 21. Read by Thomas Rose. Chapter 22 of In the Pecos Country by Edward Ellis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 22. Lost. Following the escape of their human victim, the wolves had maintained a frightful and most discordant howling, as if angered beyond expression at the style in which they had been baffled of their prey. The lad sat listening to this, when suddenly it ceased. Silence from each beast came as completely and simultaneously as if they were members of an orchestra subject to the wand of such an enchanter as Theodore Thomas.
What could it be?
For the space of 2 or 3 minutes, the silence remained as profound as that of the tomb, and then there came a rush and patter made by the wolves as they fled pell-mell. At first sight, this seemed a reason for congratulation in getting rid of such unwelcome company, but Fred saw in it more cause for alarm. Very evidently, the creatures would not have left the spot in such a hurry unless they were frightened away by some wild animal more to be dreaded than themselves.
"I'm afraid I'll have to use my rifle," he thought, as he moved softly downward until he reached a point from which he could see anything that passed beneath. "It's pretty rough to have to fire a fellow's last shot when he's likely to starve to death for it, but a beast that can scare away a pack of wolves is likely to be one that will take a well-aimed bullet to stop."
This train of thought was abruptly checked by a sight which almost paralyzed him. He could dimly discern the ground beneath, and he was watching and listening, when a large figure came to view and halted directly beneath him, where the first wolf had sat upon his haunches and looked so longingly upward. No noise could be heard, and it seemed to move like a phantom. But even in the gloom, the peculiar swinging motion of the body showed prodigious strength and activity. There could be no doubt, either, that the animal was a climber, and therefore more to be feared than 1,000 wolves. Fred had gained quite a knowledge of the animals of the country on his way across the plains, and in the indistinct view obtained, he made up his mind that this was that most dangerous of wild beasts in the Southwest, the American cougar. If such were the case, the lad's only defense lay in the single charge of his rifle. The cougar could leap among the limbs as easily as a cat bounds from the floor into the chair. Fred had left his rifle beyond his reach, and he was about to climb up to it when the possibility occurred to him that perhaps the cougar was not aware that anyone was in the tree, and, if unmolested, might pass by. Accordingly, the fugitive remained as motionless as a statue, his eyes fixed upon the dreaded brute, ready to make for his gun the instant the cougar showed any signs of making for him. The animal, known in some parts of the country as the panther, or painter, remained equally motionless. It looked precisely as if he suspected that something was in the wind, and had slipped up to this point to listen for some evidence of what it was. Fred, who had heard fabulous stories of the smelling powers of all wild animals, feared that the cougar would scent him out, but he showed no evidence of his ability to do so. After remaining stationary a minute or two, he moved forward a couple of steps, and then paused as before. The lad was fearful that this was an indication that he had detected his presence in the tree, and was about to make his leap, but preliminary to doing so, all such animals squat upon their haunches and pick out a perch at which to aim. This he had not done, and the boy waited for it before changing his own position. The head of the cougar was close to the trunk of the tree, and he had maintained the attitude but a few seconds when he started forward again, and continued until he vanished from view.
"I hope he is gone,"
was the wish that came to Fred as he peered through the leaves in his efforts to catch a glimpse of him. But the intervening leaves prevented, and he saw him no more. He remained where he was for some time, on the lookout for the beast, but finally climbed back to his former place, where his gun was within reach, and where he disposed himself as comfortably as possible. In less than 10 minutes thereafter, the whole pack of wolves were back again. The cougar had departed, and they returned to claim their breakfast. They were somewhat less demonstrative in their manner, as though they did not wish to bring the panther back again. They were scarcely upon the ground, however, when Fred noticed that it was growing light in the east. The long, terrible night, the most dreadful of his life, was about over, and he welcomed the coming day as the shipwrecked mariner does the approach of the friendly sail. The light rapidly increased, and in a short time the sun itself appeared, driving the darkness from the mountain, and bathing all in its rosy hues. The wolves seemed to dread its coming somewhat as they did that of the cougar. By the time the morning was fairly upon them, one of them slunk away, another speedily followed, and it soon became a stampede. Fred waited a while, and then peered out. Not a wolf was to be seen, and he concluded it was safe to descend. He made several careful surveys of his surroundings before trusting his feet on solid ground again. When he found himself there, he grasped his rifle firmly, half expecting the formidable cougar to pounce upon him from some hiding place. But everything remained quiet, and he finally ventured to move off toward the eastward, feeling quite nervous until he had gone a couple of 100 yards and was given some assurance that no wild beasts held him in sight. Now that the lad had some opportunity to gather his wits, he paused to consider what was best to do, for with the coming of daylight came the necessity for serious work. His disposition was to return to the ravine, which he had left for the purpose of seeking a sleeping place, and to press homeward as rapidly as possible. There was no time to be lost, for many a long and wearisome mile lay between him and New Boston. As was natural, Fred was hungry again, but he resolved to make no attempt to secure food until nightfall, and to spend the intervening time in traveling. Of course, if a campfire should come his way where he was likely to find any remnants of food, he did not intend to pass it by, but his wish was to improve the day while it lasted. By taking to the ravine again, he entered upon the Apache highway, where he was likely at any moment, and especially at the sharp turns, to come in collision with the red men, but the advantage was too great to overlook, and he hoped by the exercise of unusual care to keep out of all such peril. He was on the margin of the plateau, and before returning to the gorge, he thought it best to venture upon a little exploration of his own. Possibly he might stumble upon some narrower pass, one unfit for horses, which would afford him a chance of getting out of the mountains without the great risk of meeting his old enemies. For a short distance, the way was so broken that his progress was slow. He found himself clambering up a ledge of rocks. Then he was forced to make his way around some massive boulders, and in picking his way along a steep place, the gravelly earth gave way beneath his weight, and he slid fully 100 feet before he could check himself. His descent was so gradual that he was not bruised in the slightest, but he was nearly buried beneath the gravel and dirt that came rattling down after him.
"I wish I could travel all the way home that way," he laughed, as he picked himself up. "I would soon get there, and wouldn't have to work very hard either."
But this was not very profitable work, and when he had quaffed his fill from a small rivulet of icy cold water, he was conscious of the importance of going forward without any further delay.
"I guess the best thing I can do is to get back in that ravine or pass without any more foolery. It looks as though the way was open ahead yonder."
It was useless to attempt to retrace his steps, for it was impossible to climb up that incline which came so near burying him out of sight. So he moved forward, with rocks all around him, right, left, in the rear, and in the front. There was considerable stunted vegetation also, and as the day was quite warm and no wind could reach him, he found the labor of traveling with a heavy rifle anything but fun. Still, he had no thought of giving up, or even halting to rest, so long as his strength held out, and he kept it up until he concluded that it was about time that he reached the ravine for which he aimed from the first.
"It must be right ahead yonder," he said, after pausing to survey his surroundings. "I've kept going toward it ever since I picked myself up, and I know I wasn't very far away."
He had been steadily ascending for a half hour, and he believed that he had nearly reached the level upon which he had spent the night. His view was so shut in by the character of his surroundings that he could recognize nothing, and he was compelled, therefore, to depend upon his own sagacity. Fred had enough wit to take every precaution against going astray, for he had learned long since how liable anyone in his circumstances was to make such a blunder. He fixed the position of the sun with regard to the ravine, and as the orb was only a short distance above the horizon, he was confident of keeping his reckoning. "That's mighty strange!" he exclaimed, when, having climbed up the place he had fixed in his mind, he looked over and found nothing but a broken country beyond. "There isn't anything there that looks like the pass I'm looking for." He took note of the position of the sun, and then carefully recalled the direction of the ravine with regard to that, and he could discover no error in the course which he had followed. According to the reasoning of common sense, he ought to strike it at right angles, but just then he recalled that the gorge did not follow a straight line. Had it done so, he would have succeeded in what he had undertaken, but it was otherwise, and so he failed. "I'll try a little more." With no little labor, he climbed to an eminence a short distance away, where he hoped to gain a glimpse of the promised land. But the most studied scrutiny failed to show anything resembling the pass. "I'm lost!" he exclaimed in despair. End of Chapter 22. Read by Thomas Rose. Chapter 23 of In the Pecos Country by Edward Ellis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 23. A Perilous Passage. Fred Munson was right. In his efforts to regain the pass by which he had entered the mountains, he had gone astray, and he knew no more in what direction to turn than if he had dropped from the moon. The sun was now well up above the horizon, and he not only had the mortification of feeling that he had lost much precious time, but that he was likely to lose much more. With the feeling of disappointment came that of hunger, and he questioned himself as to how he was likely to obtain that with which to stave off the pangs of hunger. "There isn't any use of staying here," he exclaimed, desperately, "unless I want to lie down and die, and I ain't quite ready for that yet. It is pretty sure the ravine ain't straight ahead, so it must be more to one side." And acting upon this conclusion, he made quite a change in the direction he was pursuing, moving off to the left, and encouraging himself with the fact that the pass must be somewhere, and he had only to persevere in exploring each point of the compass to reach it at last. His route continued as precipitous and difficult as before, and it was not long before the plague of thirst became greater than that of hunger, but he persevered, hopeful that his wearisome wandering would soon end. "Helloa, here I am again!" This exclamation was caused by the sudden arrival upon the edge of a ravine, which on first thought he supposed to be the very one for which he was making. But a second glance convinced him of his error, for it was nothing more than a yawn or chasm that had probably been opened in the mountains by some great convulsion of nature. Making his way carefully to the edge, Fred saw that it had a varying depth of 50 to 200 feet, and a width from a dozen yards to 3 times as much, its length seemingly too great to be gone around by an ordinary traveler, and yet finding himself confronted by such a chasm, it was perhaps natural that the lad should become more fully persuaded than ever of the absolute necessity of placing himself upon the opposite side. The more he thought upon it, the more convinced did he become, until his desire of passing over became a wild sort of eagerness that would not let him rest. "I don't believe the pass is more than 100 yards from the other side, and the two must run nearly parallel, so I am bound to get over in some way." In the hope that some narrow portion might be found, he made his way with great care along the margin, until fully an hour had been spent in this manner, with a result that could not be called very satisfactory. "If I could jump about 3 times as far as I can, I could go across right yonder. Hello, why didn't I notice that before?" And the words were yet in his mouth when he started on a run along the margin of the ravine, at the imminent risk of falling in and breaking his neck. He had espied not only a narrower portion of the ravine, but what seemed to be a fallen tree extending from one side to the other. If such were really the case, What more could he need? He had thought over this matter of the pass being upon the other side, until no doubt at all remained in his mind, and now the discovery that the chasm was bridged caused the strongest rebound from discouragement to hope. Upon reaching the bridge, he found that it answered his purpose admirably. The width was less than 10 yards, although the depth was enough to make him shudder when he peered down into it. He flung a stone, and as it went spinning downward, it seemed to him that many seconds elapsed before it struck the bottom with a dull thud. But the tree seemed strong enough to answer every purpose, and capable of bearing a weight much greater than his. The trunk, at the largest part, was fully a foot in diameter, and the top extended far enough over the opposite edge to prevent any weakness from the thinning out of the branches. But what astonished Fred more than anything else was the discovery that the tree had been felled not by nature, but by man. The trunk had been cut through clearly and evenly by some sharp instrument, and beyond question had been used as a bridge before.
"Somebody has been here ahead of me," reflected the lad, as he examined this interesting evidence, "and I don't believe it was an Indian either. I don't know what could bring a party into this part of the world, but they have been here surely, and if the bridge was good enough for them, it will do for me."
He was quite certain that he could walk over after the fashion of Blondin, but it would have been foolhardy in the highest degree, and he adopted the wiser course of putting himself astride of the trunk and hitching along a few inches at a time. His rifle interfered somewhat, but he kept up his progress, pausing a few seconds at the center of the chasm to look down at the bottom far below him.
"Suppose the tree should break!" he exclaimed in a frightened whisper. "It would be the last of a fellow. No one could drop down there and save his neck without a parachute. I guess the best thing I can do is to get over as soon as I know how."
At this juncture, as he was on the point of resuming his onward progress, he noticed a peculiar jar of the log, accompanied by a scratching. His first impression was that it came from behind, but upon turning his head could see nothing. When, however, he looked forward, the terrible explanation at once appeared. The head, or top of the tree, was unusually bushy and luxuriant, and although a considerable time had elapsed since it had been felled, yet there were a great many leaves clinging to the branches, enough to afford concealment to any animal fleeing from a hunter. When Fred first looked in that direction, he failed to see that one of the most dangerous animals of the Southwest was crouching there. As he looked inquiringly ahead now, he observed a huge American cougar, larger than that of the night before, issuing from among the branches. With his phosphorescent eyes fixed upon the terrified lad, he was stealing slowly along the log, giving utterance to a deep guttural growl, separating his lips as he did so as to show his long, white, needle-like teeth intended for the rending of flesh. For a moment, Fred was transfixed at the sight. The cougar clearly meant to fight, and assumed the offensive without a second's hesitancy. He seemed to have been crouching in the bushes, and calmly awaited the time when the boy should advance too far to retreat.
"I guess I'd better go back,"
exclaimed the latter, recovering himself and beginning his retrograde movement, but a few hitches showed that he could not escape the cougar in this fashion if he really meant business, and it looked very much as if he did. The beast had already left the other side, and, like his intended victim, was supported over the chasm by the tree. He had advanced beyond the fork made by the junction of the lowermost branches with the main stem, and was stealing along with an appearance of excessive caution, but really with the certainty of a brute who feels that there is no escape for his prey. He moved slowly, burying his long, sharp claws so deeply in the bark at each step that his feet seemed to stick as he lifted them again. All the time, his large, round eyes, which had a greenish glare like those of a cat, were never removed from the face of the lad, and the guttural growl that came from the lowermost depths of his chest was like the muttering of distant thunder. It was not until about a dozen feet separated the two that Fred recalled that his case was not so desperate as he had imagined. He held a loaded rifle at his command, and the distance was too short for any mistake to be made in the aim.
"I guess I'll stop your fun," was the exultant exclamation of the lad as he brought his rifle to his shoulder. "I don't like to throw away a shot on you, but I don't see how it can be helped."
He sighted directly between the eyes. His hand shook a little, and the weapon was heavy, but it was impossible that he should miss. The cougar continued his slow, cautious advance, apparently unaware or uncaring for the deadly weapon aimed at him. The distance was very slight between the two when the trigger was pulled, and the heavy bullet, tearing its way through bone and muscle, buried itself in the brain, extinguishing life with the suddenness almost of the lightning stroke. The guttural growl wound up with something like a hoarse yelp, and the cougar made what might be termed his death leap. The bound was a tremendous one, carrying him clear up over the head of the lad, who crouched down in affright, expecting him to drop upon his shoulders, but he passed far beyond, dropping upon the trunk of the tree, which he clutched and clawed in his blind, frantic way, without saving himself in the least, and down he went. Fred was held with a sort of fascination, and had turned his head sufficiently to watch every movement of his victim. When he started downward, his whitish belly was turned upward, while he continued to beat and claw the air in his death struggles. As is the tendency of falling bodies, the carcass of the cougar showed an inclination to revolve. It began slowly turning over as it descended, and it must have completed several revolutions when it struck the rocky ground below like a limp bundle of rags, and lay motionless. The boy, from his lofty perch, watched the form below him for several minutes, but could detect no sign of life, and rightly concluded there was none.
"I wonder whether there are any more there," he exclaimed, hesitating to go backward while he scrutinized the branches with the keenest kind of anxiety. "I don't see any chance where one could hide, and yet I didn't see that other fellow."
It was hardly possible that he should find a companion to the one he had just slain, and he resumed his hitching forward, making it as deliberate and careful as he could. Clutching the branches, he hurried forward, and was soon upon the other side of the chasm, which had come so nigh witnessing his death. Without pausing longer, he hastened on, and was not long in placing himself upon the top of the elevation from which he was so confident of gaining his view of the promised land, as the pass had become to him, now that it seemed so difficult to find, and was so necessary to anything like progress. But another disappointment awaited him. The most careful scrutiny failed to reveal anything like the ravine, and poor Fred was forced to the conclusion that he was hopelessly lost, and nothing but Providence could bring him through the labyrinth of peril in which he was entangled. End of Chapter 23. Read by Thomas Rose.